Recently, some studies have pointed to the idea that human intelligence is decreasing. This has been done by the measurement and the use of some psychometric tests, such as the IQ, intelligence quotient, and also through the International Cognitive Ability Resources tests. And so before we move on and analyze these results, we first must identify and define what intelligence actually is. And so when people think about intelligence, they normally think about two types of intelligence. One, which is the traditional form of intelligence, which is fluid intelligence, so the ability to reason and engage in abstract and complex tasks. And then we also have emotional intelligence. In this video, I'll be mostly focusing on the first type of intelligence, which is the one that most people think when, for instance, you ask someone or you think about whether someone is intelligent. And normally you don't think about whether that person is intelligent based on their ability to manage their emotions and to interpret the emotions of others. You mostly think of, well, can you solve an integral equation? And so in this video, I'll be more focused on that. But alongside fluid intelligence, we also have crystallized intelligence, which is essentially just refers to the accumulation of knowledge that an individual obtains throughout their lives. And so while fluid intelligence tends to peak at age 25 and then steadily declines after that, sort of following the plasticity curve, crystallized intelligence normally grows until age 60, 65, and then it slowly starts decreasing as well. But in essence, to simplify what intelligence actually is and to avoid too much of technical jargon, we can see intelligence as the ability to problem solve. And so when we entered these discussions about intelligence, normally people like to compare human intelligence with the intelligence of other beings. And so it is very common, if you search the internet, to see questions such as, oh, what's the IQ of a dolphin? Or what's the IQ of my dog or a chimpanzee? And so I believe that these are misguided questions because intelligence is an adaptive phenomenon. And so intelligence, therefore, must be directly correlated with the environmental challenges that a being faces. And so in the cases of chimpanzee, dolphins, and other animals, they do not need to be preoccupied with solving algebraic equations or other forms of problem solving that humans must engage with. In their cases, their intelligence is selective for the tasks that create more challenges in their own lives. And so, for example, when we look at animals, we can see that they have very high visual spatial abilities. And this is a form of intelligence. They're able to recognize patterns in the environment perhaps much better than we humans are. And so we need to be careful when we talk about what intelligence is and how it should be interpreted depending on the context. This even applies to us as human beings because each of us, although we are constrained by a likelihood of similar problems because we live in a society and therefore our environment has somewhat been homogenized, each one of us faces different challenges. And so the problems that we need to face in our daily lives differ. And so that will also generate different intelligence requirements. But so intelligence has always been a fascination of scientists. It has also been used as a tool to discriminate. But when we look, for example, at what intelligence is, and we recognize that there is a biological basis to intelligence that should be dependent on our hardware, the brain, we have several studies that have tried to pinpoint what are the neural correlates or the neuroanatomical features that can help us somewhat predict someone's level of intelligence. And here we can look at different aspects of what the brain might give us. We can look at global volume, so we can see the brain as a whole and see whether having a larger brain volume will correlate with higher degrees of intelligence. In this case, for instance, IQ scores, so the ability to reason, the ability to do complex problem solving. And so there is some correlation, although not that significant, with brain volume and intelligence. And sometimes what we see is that even when you increase brain volume, the degree of increase in that brain volume sometimes is not also perceived in terms of the actual output. So for example, if you increase the human brain by a factor of 3, it would be very surprising if that being which has a brain 3 times as big as us actually has 3 times the intelligence that we human beings have. Other than global volume, we can also look at lobar volume, so regional volume. We can see whether someone who is very skilled at mathematics or a very skilled musician or someone who's essentially has a very high skill level for a certain craft, we can then look at the brain and try to pinpoint whether there is a specific brain region which is higher in volume. And so, for example, in this respect, normally what we try to look at are the regions in the frontal lobe, in the prefrontal cortex, to be more specific. And so here we can see sometimes that there is some correlation between the development of some brain regions. For instance, in the case of musicians, we oftentimes see more developed and larger volumes in the medial temporal lobe, which are regions which are involved in memory. And so sometimes we can point to some potential neurocorrelates, although most of these are far from perfect, and in terms of statistical significance, we do not see that much of a broad effect. Other than that, we can also look at highly localized measurements of neurocorrelates. We can look at, for example, voxel level units. We can sort of understand it at the level of the circuits. And here it's also one of the questions that intelligence researchers have often made, which is, are we simply more intelligent than, for example, than chimpanzees because we have larger brains? Or is it just actually a matter of us having more neurons? And some researchers also argue that it's maybe not necessarily the case of having a larger brain, although that seems to play a role. It also doesn't seem to be a matter of just having more neurons, because the difference in neurons between a human being and a chimpanzee, for example, doesn't seem to be sufficient to explain the diverse range of intelligence being observed. And so what some researchers also argue is that maybe it's the case of the amount of connections that a neuron can make. And so some argue that the human brain is able to form, with the neurons that it has, far more connections than, for example, other animals. Then some other researchers also argue that it's a matter of cell type, that perhaps humans have neuronal types that other animals don't really have. And so this is the case, for example, with some researchers arguing that we have these neurons, these concept cells, which are important in memory formation, that maybe they're not as present, or maybe not actually even present, in many of the animals that we tend to compare ourselves with. And so this is all just to say that the study of intelligence is actually a very complex topic. And even from the use of these psychometric scales such as IQ, which of course has a lot of criticism that I will shortly address, even when we look at the biological basis of intelligence, it's also not clear what makes someone or something more intelligent than someone else. But so when it comes to our measurements of intelligence, the first metric of intelligence came from the Benet-Simon test, which was developed by a French psychologist and psychiatrist to assess cognitive delays in children. And so a few years after that, a guy called William Stern then coined the term intelligence quotient. And this is what we mean by an IQ test. And so an IQ test basically situates you along a Gaussian curve, so it puts you alongside a normal distribution. And in this case, by today's benchmarks, for example, in the Wechsler tests, 95% of the population is within an IQ score of 70 to 130 points. And when we are looking at these scores, normally what we see is that newer generations perform better on these IQ tests than previous generations. And this is called the Flynn Effect. And so this doesn't necessarily mean that younger generations are more intelligent than past generations. What it means is that the newer generations are better at taking these tests. And so there are plenty of reasons that can be used to understand why perhaps these IQ scores have been increasing over time. So historically, since the mid-20th century, we have seen that IQ boomed worldwide, particularly in BRIC countries. However, since the late 1990s, we have seen a decline in this trend, even having some studies saying that it's not just a matter of a decline in the rate of increased scores, we're actually now having lower IQ scores than past generations. And this is not just the case with IQ scores, it's also the case with the scores collected in the International Cognitive Ability Resource Tests. And so this is what some researchers call the reverse Flynn effect, which is, like I mentioned previously, we have this tendency where younger generations have better IQ scores. And the reasons for this is that education levels have gotten better, diet has gotten better, general quality of life has gotten better, and all of that will, of course, create people who are better at taking these tests. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are actually more intelligent than those in the past generation. And so this reverse Flynn effect argues that those same environmental factors that in the past has created an increase in our IQ scores are now working in the opposite direction. And so the environment we are living in is somehow worsening our scores in these psychometric tests, and that's maybe a warning sign that we as humans are becoming less intelligent. And so this claim can be deconstructed in various ways. One of them is whether you believe that an IQ test is a sufficient measure to actually determine someone's intelligence. And as we know, an IQ test is flawed in many manners. You can actually train yourself to be better at taking IQ tests. IQ tests, as some argue, are maybe outdated, so they do not capture the necessary forms of intelligence that the younger generation actually needs to adapt to their current environment. So that could be the case. Although we can also argue that, like any psychometric test, we cannot expect such a test to be a perfect representative of what intelligence actually is, but we can use it, and it is helpful, and it can serve as a predictor of some things. It can be a predictor, for example, of academic success, although it is not a perfect predictor. IQ test also seems to be correlated with your ability to do certain professions. Yet in isolation, it is far from being a perfect predictor of success overall in life. And so many researchers also argue that intelligence is mainly genetic. It is genetically predetermined. And so let's see if we can grasp what this actually means. When researchers say that intelligence is mainly genetic, it means that throughout your whole life, you're operating under this potential theoretical level of intelligence that you can obtain. And so, for example, there's a genetic combination of factors that, for example, makes your highest potential IQ 140. And the meaning of having this theoretical roof is that no matter what you do in your life, that's your limit. You cannot surpass it. The only thing you can do is to engage in behaviors and practices that get you closer to that theoretical limit. But also, as we know, and this is mentioned in the epigenetic revolution, we know that the function of a gene is highly dependent on the environment. And so there's this gene-environment interactions, which are extremely important. So this also means that in the case of IQ, what you actually do to your brain and the environment you live in is highly important, and perhaps far more important than the actual genetic composition or constitutions that create that theoretical limit. So let's say, for example, that you're taking an IQ test at 6 a.m. on a Saturday, and the night before it, you went out with your friends, you drank a lot, and so you go to the test and you're sleep deprived. You're probably going to score far less than if you were well rested. So we know that we can do things that can increase our intelligence or not. And other than this is also a whole research on, for instance, the correlation between intelligence and mental disorders, intelligence being measured mainly through the use of IQ tests. And then there's this argument that a lot of these different mental disorders, for example, OCD, is associated with lower IQ scores. For me, this was deeply disturbing when I read that, because I have OCD and I just felt that I have a low IQ. But then the problem with this research is that saying that someone that has a lower IQ is at a higher risk of having OCD, or that somehow lower intelligence is what drives OCD, may be a flawed statement, because we all know that feeling depressed, feeling anxious, or just being in a state of mental suffering is most likely going to decrease your intelligence or your ability to problem solve, because all of your mental resources are being used somewhere else, and it's just hard to concentrate and pay enough attention and be motivated to actually solve problems. But oh well, that just might be the case that I'm misinterpreting the data, because since I have OCD, I have a lower IQ. And so overall, what does this mean? How can I interpret all of this data? So for one, my opinion is that these tests are not, of course, conclusive. IQ is a flawed means of just defining whether someone's intelligent or not. It just tells you if you're able to solve a particular set of problems, and it is specific to the framework in which it operates, just like any other psychometric test. But I do think that as we evolve as a society and we develop new technologies, this is, of course, going to influence our ability to problem solve. But this is not just something that is recent. This has been something that has been present in the past. Let's look, for example, at the invention of a calculator. By having a calculator by your side, now most likely you're going to outsource your need for arithmetic calculations to the calculator, meaning that you will most likely become worse at doing arithmetic operations. And so it is one of those abilities, whether you actually do it or not. For example, people who haven't studied math for a long time, if you ask them, for example, when they go out to dinner to split a bill and to do that math in their own heads, you're going to probably take more time than someone who is constantly being stimulated and doing those types of exercises. Because the brain is just like any muscle. You use it or lose it. And so the big question here is, does your decreased ability to do arithmetic operations have some sort of hidden cost? So is it the case that by getting worse at doing these simple and basic math operations, you're also somehow being cognitively affected in some other domain? But so these days, there's also the case that we are outsourcing more and more our cognitive abilities. We have the issue with the use of, for example, ChatGPT, where a lot of people are just using ChatGPT to generate text, to create content. And so by doing so, a lot of our creative and even other forms of endeavors, such as, for example, coding, programming, all of that, we are outsourcing more and more these things into platforms that can do that for us. And so some question whether that's going to carry a cost, whether the fact that we are outsourcing all of these cognitive faculties to something else and we are more and more stopping to do these things, will that have a cost? We're also living in an age where we have a lot of short-form content, we have a lot of reels, we have shorts, we have a lot of these, very high stimulus, high rewards, low effort exposures. And so that might also be detrimental to our ability to problem solve. And this might itself show as a decline in the IQ scores. Because if you're less able to focus, to have attention, to be motivated to solve a problem, that is, of course, going to impact your ability to think. It is also the case that people are reading less and less because there's such an abundance of visual media. And so we know that one of the things that contributes into our ability to improve our speech and to have a better vocabulary is reading. And so if people start reading less, and so the point here is that if you are looking for a biological basis of trying to determine why these scores might be going down, and you compare the brains of the current generation with the brains of older generations, it is unlikely that you would be able to find neurocorrelates that could justify perhaps this decline in IQ scores. Following the argument that intelligence is mainly genetic, it also doesn't make much sense to argue that this decline in these intelligence measurements is due to genetic factors. This is also not a strong argument. The thing is, we are using cognitive hardware that has been present for thousands of years, and our brains take a very, very long time, like any biological function or system, to evolve. And so to conclude, there is another thing that must be mentioned, which was very well said by a researcher, Stanislas Dehaene, which is this idea that just like trees can't reach the sky, there are inevitably limits to what the human brain can do. So it might be the case that we reach the point where we have fully optimized our intelligence metrics, meaning that just like someone, can grow past perhaps 2 meters and 50 centimeters. I don't know what the highest human being is, but we can with some certainty agree that there's probably a limit. It could also be the case that also we have reached the limit of our human intelligence. And so overall, all of this research can be simplified into the question, have humans become less able to problem solve? And so, in my opinion, I would say that this is a highly dependent question because all of us face different problems in our day-to-day lives. But I would also say that it's not surprising that our ability to engage in complex and abstract reasoning has gone down, given that we know that excessive internet use can affect verbal intelligence. We know that the rising rates of mental health issues will also impact our ability to problem solve and think. We know that our inability to tolerate boredom is gonna impact our creativity, and that's also going to be detrimental. But another aspect of this equation, which I'm just going to touch upon briefly, is the idea of emotional intelligence. And we know that emotional intelligence is actually a very good predictor of professional success. And we also have some studies showing that emotional intelligence is also declining. And here it is not a surprising result. This has been, of course, augmented by the pandemic, and this is going to mainly affect the younger generations, which had to go through that period where they were in isolation. And as we know, there are critical periods in our development, critical periods where we need to receive certain stimuli in order to develop and optimize our behavior. And so due to the pandemic, we had a lot of kids who were unable to be with their peers. They were stuck at home. They were stuck behind the computer watching screens. And so we know that this inability to receive feedback from a community, because we know that it is through interaction with other people that we sort of regulate our own behaviors. Losing that aspect, losing that ability may also prove to be something that can be extremely harmful. And we have certain societies, certain cultures. For example, in Japan, we seem to have this issue where some of the population prefers to just stay at home, connected with their own technologies rather than socialize. And so we just need to keep close to our hearts this idea that technology evolves faster than biology. And so because of that, we're going to face problems that we haven't yet formulated the answers to. And we also might have problems that we don't even realize we have currently. And so overall, this is my reads on some of the studies that have been released. I just think we need to be aware that some of the practices or things that we habitually do might affect a lot of our cognitive faculties. And so we should try to do things that allow us and stimulate us in a way that allows us to be more functional in our day-to-day lives. And just as a final remark, we know from some studies that one of the best things you can do to preserve your intelligence is to engage in physical exercise. That seems to preserve a lot of our cognitive faculties. So hopefully you found this video useful, and let me know in the comments what do you think about this potential decline in human intelligence.